plantains, children kicking deflated soccer balls, and grandmothers whispering prayers over bubbling pots of soup. It was here, in the middle of this chaotic beauty, that Chief Damilare Adebayo had built his empire. To the city, he was a hero. To outsiders, he was a miracle worker. To the cameras, he was the embodiment of generosity. Every month, without fail, he would fund construction projects in distant villages, supply hospitals with equipment, and send foodstuffs to orphanages he had never set foot in. His name appeared in newspapers and magazines, and the words generous, compassionate, and blessed followed him like shadows. Chief Damilare is one of a kind, one reporter had said on live television, as cameras zoomed in on him handing over envelopes of money to trembling beneficiaries. He has a heart that knows no boundaries. If only all wealthy men in Nigeria could emulate his example. But behind the smiles, the applause, and the flashy cars, the reality in his own family compound was starkly different. Chief Damilare's family had grown up in Oberlin's older quarters, where electricity was a luxury, and clean water was often carried in buckets from communal taps. His father, a stern but fair man, had died when Damilare was just a teenager, leaving the household to his mother's weary hands. She had worked tirelessly, selling roasted corn on busy corners, just enough to feed her children and send Damilare to school. Despite the hardships, the children were close. Damilare's cousins Bisi, Chaka, and Ifema were as much siblings as friends. They shared everything: school books, secret hideouts, even the odd mango that fell from the trees in the neighborhood. Years later, when Damilare's star finally rose, the family expected him to remember them. They believed that the boy who once shared his last piece of cabin biscuit with a cousin would still have that heart. But Damilare was no longer the boy of the alleyways. The first hint of his change was subtle. When Chaka lost his job at a local printing press, he approached Damilare for help. "I just need a little to cover rent," Chaka said, holding the worn envelope nervously. Damilare's eyes were cold, almost clinical. "I don't have money." Chaka blinked. "What do you mean? You just last week, you donated millions to a school we've never even heard of." "I don't have money for family," Damilare replied sharply. "You think wealth grows on trees?" Chaka left with a heavy heart. Over time, all the cousins learned to stop asking. Yet the paradox of Damilare's generosity remained baffling. He would throw lavish parties for strangers. He would build boreholes in remote villages, fund surgeries for children he had never met, and give cars to complete acquaintances. The world cheered him, while his own blood went hungry. The city whispered about him. "Why does he help everyone except his family? No one understands it," the neighbors would reply. Some began to joke that perhaps Damilare had been cursed, or that the family was unlucky, or worse, that he simply had no heart for kin. But there was more to Damilare's wealth than the public could see. A darkness that no camera could capture, no microphone could record. It started years ago, shortly after his first major business deal. In a modest office, smelling faintly of ink and polished wood, Damelair had been approached by a tall man with eyes like burning coals. The man offered him riches beyond imagination, luxury apartments, fast cars, lucrative contracts. All Damelair had to do was obey. "Do as we say," the man had whispered, "and wealth will follow. Fail, and poverty will consume you." Damelair, driven by desperation and ambition, had agreed. One of the rules, he was told, was simple but unyielding: never use the wealth to help his family. To do so would break the covenant and bring ruin. At first, he had been shocked. How could anyone forbid a man from helping his blood? But the lure of the riches, the comfort, the security, the power was irresistible. Soon, he was signing contracts, shaking hands, and watching his wealth grow with almost magical speed. The first test came soon after. Bisi, his cousin, came to him one evening, her son barely 10 years old. The boy, Tunde, had fallen sick with high fever. She begged Damelair for a small sum to pay for proper treatment. Damelair had stared at her, a pang of guilt stabbing at him, and said, "I don't have money." Bisi had been dumbfounded. "But you gave money to a stranger yesterday. You donated 500,000 to a child in Lagos you've never even met." "I don't have money for family," Damelair said, coldly, the words slicing through the room. Tears streamed down her face as she left empty-handed. At the time, Damelair justified it to himself. It was business. It was a rule. A law he had accepted. But inside, a seed of unease had taken root. Each refusal made him richer, yes, but it also made his nights restless. Each denial left a ghost in his heart. Despite the unease, Damelair continued his public life. Charity events, donation drives, and headline-making gifts became his mask. He smiled at cameras, shook hands with grateful strangers, and even gave interviews where he encouraged the public to help the needy. Yet in the quiet of his mansion, surrounded by marble floors and crystal chandeliers, he felt the emptiness growing. It was on one such night, as he counted the receipts of yet another donation, that he first heard the whispering. A soft, low voice, almost indistinguishable from the wind. "Remember the rule. Family is forbidden." He had shaken his head, laughing nervously. "It's just my imagination," he muttered. But the whispers persisted. Each night, growing clearer, more insistent. Sometimes, he saw shadows flicker across the walls, shadows that did not belong to any human form. The wealth continued to multiply. With every family refusal, his bank accounts swelled. With every envelope handed to strangers, his business empire expanded. But the cost was becoming harder to ignore. Back in the old neighborhood, the family struggled. Bisi's son had recovered from minor illnesses in the past, but without proper care, he had begun to fall behind in school. Cheka's business ventures failed repeatedly. Ifema had to pawn jewelry just to survive. Each time they approached Damelair, doors slammed in their faces, excuses given, promises denied. The cousins whispered among themselves, sometimes in anger, sometimes in disbelief. How can he be so heartless? Bisi asked one night, her voice trembling as she rocked Tunde to sleep. Maybe he doesn't remember what it's like to suffer, Chaka replied bitterly. No, Ifema said softly. It's something else. I feel it. Something unnatural. Meanwhile, Damilare himself was torn between fear and greed. The wealth was intoxicating, and yet it was a curse in disguise. And so, the city celebrated the generous man, unaware that his wealth was built on an unspoken rule of cruelty, a covenant that demanded the suffering of his own blood. And Damilare, the man who fed strangers and starved his blood, continued to live in the golden cage of his own making. In one of the older neighborhoods, the small home of Bisi sat quietly among the chaos. It was a modest structure, painted in fading shades of brown, with a tin roof that rattled whenever the wind blew hard. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with worry. Tunde, her 10-year-old son, lay shivering under a thin blanket. His small chest rose and fell rapidly, and beads of sweat formed on his young forehead. Bisi held his tiny hand in hers, her own trembling as she tried to comfort him. Please, Tunde, please get better, she whispered, her voice breaking. You can't leave me. Not now. Not like this. But Tunde's eyes, half closed, reflected pain beyond his years. The little boy's body had been weakened by days of high fever and untreated infection. The local clinic had done all it could, but Bisi knew that without proper hospital care, her son would not survive. Her heart pounded as she made the decision that she had dreaded. She would go to Chief Damilare Adebayo, her cousin, her family's golden hope. The journey to Damilare's mansion was like crossing worlds. She left the modest alleyways, walked past neon-lit streets, and finally arrived at the gates of a grand compound. High walls of polished stone enclosed the mansion, fountains splashed in artificial sunlight even at night, and security guards patrolled the perimeter with machine-like precision. Bisi's hands shook as she explained her situation. My son, he is very sick. Please, Dami, please help us, she pleaded, trying to hide her desperation beneath a veil of dignity. The guards looked at her strangely, then buzzed her in. She was led through the marble halls to Damilare's office, a room that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. He sat behind a massive desk, sipping wine while watching the evening news. The irony was almost unbearable. The news segment featured one of Damilare's recent charitable donations to a village hundreds of miles away. Bisi fell to her knees before him, holding out a crumpled envelope. Please, I only need enough for Tunde to be admitted to a hospital tonight. I swear I will repay you as soon as I can. Please, Dami, you are my only hope. Damilare looked at her with icy calm. He set the wine glass down, his face expressionless. I told you before, he said, voice sharp, I don't have money. Bisi's mouth went dry. What do you mean? The child on television, they call you generous. They say you help the helpless. You can help him, can't you? I help strangers, Damilare said, standing now, his tone final, like a gavel striking wood. Family is different. You people will only bring trouble if I get involved. Tears streamed down Beese's face. Trouble? My child is dying. You can save him. How can you? I said no, he snapped, cutting her off. His eyes darkened, his jaw tight. Leave my house before I call security. Beesie stumbled backward, her heart breaking, and left the mansion. She walked home in silence, the weight of despair pressing against her chest like a heavy stone. That night, Tunde's condition worsened. His breathing became shallow, his fever spiking higher. Beesie tried everything she could, cold compresses, herbal remedies, prayers, but nothing worked. By dawn, Tunde's small body could no longer fight. His little hands went limp, and Beesie held him close, rocking him in her arms, whispering promises she could no longer keep. The death of Tunde was a shockwave through the family. Cousins, uncles, and aunts gathered in hushed sorrow. Tears fell freely, curses were whispered, and the young boy was buried in the quiet corner of the family compound, away from the city's noise. Through it all, Damilare did not attend. He sent only a wreath, a cold, formal gesture that spoke of distance and detachment. Yet beneath the surface, the consequences of his actions were just beginning. That night, in the grandeur of his mansion, Damilare sat in his office, staring at the shadows cast by his expensive chandeliers. The whispering had returned, louder now. Family is forbidden. Family is forbidden. It had been faint before, like wind through the trees. Now, it was clear. The voice was no longer a mere whisper, it carried authority, an almost physical weight pressing against his chest. Damilare clenched his fists, trying to shake off the fear. "It is nothing," he muttered. "I am blessed. Wealth protects me." But the shadows on the walls shifted unnaturally. He saw fleeting shapes, hands reaching, eyes glowing, forms that twisted in the corner of his vision. He blinked and they vanished, leaving only silence and the faint scent of burning herbs. Days passed, and Damilare's wealth continued to grow, yet each coin felt heavier, each donation more hollow. He attended charity events, smiled for cameras, and gave speeches about helping strangers, all while the memory of Tunde's death gnawed at the edges of his mind. Meanwhile, the rest of the family struggled. Beesie could barely recover from her grief. Cheka's failed ventures pushed him further into debt. Ifema had to pawn her jewelry just to buy food. And every time they tried to approach Damilare, he found excuses, turned away, or outright refused. The city continued to celebrate him. Newspapers praised his generosity. Social media hailed him as a miracle worker. But for his family, he had become a nightmare in a gilded frame. It was in the silence of one particularly restless night that Damilare began to see the truth of his predicament. The shadows in his mansion no longer stayed in the corners. They moved closer, curling around the edges of the furniture, creeping along the walls. Whispers filled the room, repeating the same phrase over and over. Family is forbidden. Family is forbidden. Damele's knees buckled. The wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. He realized with a cold, sinking dread that this was no ordinary warning. The wealth, the cars, the buildings, the donations, they were not free. Each time he denied his family, he had gained riches. Each time he turned away blood in need, he had strengthened the hold of the dark covenant he had agreed to years ago. And now, the price was becoming personal. The whispers were joined by visions: Tunde's small body, fevered and writhing, Beese's despair-stricken face, the cries of his cousins when they were denied help. Each vision burned into Damele's mind, relentless and unforgiving. He tried to rationalize. "It is not my fault," he muttered. "I obeyed the rules. It is the only way to stay wealthy. I am protected." But deep inside, a part of him knew, wealth without love is a prison. One night, Damele awoke to find his mansion shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. Figures moved within the mist, dark silhouettes with eyes glowing like embers. They did not speak, yet their presence was suffocating. A voice, deep and commanding, spoke from the shadows. "The blood you refused cries for justice. The covenant holds, but the debt must be repaid." Damele fell to his knees, sweat pouring down his face. "I did not," he began, but the voice interrupted, cold and final. "Your choice brought this. Now live with it." He awoke the next morning trembling, the room empty, but the fear lingered. Each night thereafter, the shadows returned. Each day, the whispers followed him. The wealth, once intoxicating, now felt like chains. Meanwhile, Beese and the rest of the family slowly began to piece together the truth. There were rumors, neighbors spoke of Damele's strange connections, whispered of secret societies and dark dealings. And though the details were unclear, one fact remained undeniable: the man who fed strangers and starved his blood was no ordinary human being. The city of Oberland seemed unchanged, bustling and bright under the morning sun. Yet inside Chief Damele Mansion, a storm had taken residence, a storm no one else could see, no one else could hear. The shadows had grown longer, darker, more purposeful. They crept along the marble floors, lingered behind doors, and seemed to whisper directly into Damele's mind. He had tried to ignore it, to focus on the donations, the interviews, the endless flow of money that had once been a thrill. But now, each coin, each note, seemed heavier than lead, each charity gift a dagger pressing against his conscience. At first, he tried to maintain the facade. Publicly, he remained the city's golden man, the generous benefactor adored by strangers and celebrated in newspapers. Yet inside, a gnawing fear ate at him. His nights were sleepless, his body frail, and the haunting whispers would not stop. "Family is forbidden. Family is forbidden. Family is forbidden," they chanted, a rhythm as steady as a drum. Damele had long suspected the truth but had refused to confront it. He had told himself the covenant was a bargain, a necessary evil to keep the wealth flowing. Helping strangers had been safe, legal, and applauded. But denying his own blood, turning away the desperate Bisi and letting Tunde die was an act he could not forget. He now understood the depth of the danger. The first sign came when the mansion itself seemed alive. Doors slammed shut of their own accord, lights flickered, and a chill that had no source crept through the corridors. Objects moved without explanation. Wine glasses rattled, curtains twitched, and mirrors reflected figures standing behind him that vanished the moment he turned. Then came the dreams, vivid, terrifying visions he could not escape. In each dream, Tunde appeared. But he was not the peaceful, sleeping boy that Damilare had seen at his cousin's house. His body was emaciated, his eyes fiery red, and he was calling out not for help, but for justice. "Why did you let me die?" the boy demanded in one dream, voice echoing like 1,000 screams. "Why did you leave me to suffer? Why?" Damilare woke screaming, sweat soaking his expensive sheets, heart hammering in his chest. Yet by morning, he attempted to regain composure. He told himself it was grief, guilt, imagination, but deep down, he knew. The covenant was alive. The occult pact that had brought him riches now demanded a higher payment, one that no gold could satisfy. It was during one particularly restless night that the messengers of the covenant appeared. They were not human. They were tall, cloaked figures with eyes like molten silver. Their presence filled the room, a pressure that made it impossible to breathe. One stepped forward, raising a skeletal hand. "You have broken the natural law," the figure intoned. "You have turned away your own blood. You have fed strangers while your kin cried in hunger. The balance must be restored." Damilare fell to his knees. I obeyed the rules," he stammered. "I followed the covenant. You gave me wealth. I did not mean harm." A chorus of whispers joined the main figure's voice. "Obedience to us is only part of the law. Blood cannot be denied forever. The debt grows. The curse waits." Panic overtook Damilare. For the first time in his life, no amount of money could save him. His hands trembled, his knees weak, his mind racing for any loophole, any excuse. But the covenant was absolute. The spirits did not negotiate. He remembered the exact moment the pact had been sealed, years ago. A ceremony in a hidden room, masked figures chanting in a language older than the city itself, the smell of smoke and iron heavy in the air. He had been told nothing could break it. Now, he understood why. The first punishment came subtly. Damilare awoke one morning to find his mansion in disarray, though no one had entered. Tables overturned, wine glasses shattered, and the walls were scratched with strange symbols. They seemed to bleed, red lines twisting and writhing across the marble. He called his staff, demanded explanations, offered bribes, but no one had seen anything. The city outside was oblivious. His accountants, his security team, even his closest associates had no knowledge of what was happening. The second punishment was more personal. His health, already fragile from sleepless nights, deteriorated rapidly. Fevers burned him, headaches split his skull, and his hands shook uncontrollably. Doctors were baffled. Tests revealed nothing. His wealth, once a source of pride and joy, now felt like chains pressing him into his bed. And then came the visions. He began seeing Tunde everywhere. In reflections of glass, in puddles of rainwater, in passing crowds. The boy's eyes followed him, accusing, pleading. Damilare could not escape. He fled the city streets, attempted to hide in hotels, traveled to remote villages, but always the boy appeared. And with each vision, the whispers intensified. You denied blood. You denied life. Justice must be served. Damilare's pride, once unshakable, began to crumble. He tried to reason with the spirits. I will give back all my money. I will pay for their debts. I will do anything. The spirit's reply was merciless. Money cannot repay the debt of life. Blood cries louder than gold. One night, driven to the edge of madness, Damilare returned to the old family compound. He arrived under the cover of darkness, hoping to see Bisi, hoping for forgiveness, hoping to somehow reverse the damage. But the compound was silent, filled with shadows of mourning. The family had moved on as best they could, burying their grief deep, surviving without him. He called out for Bisi, for Chaka, for Ifema. No one answered. Only the wind whispered back, carrying the echo of Tunde's small voice. In desperation, Damilare sought out the old herbalist, the same woman who had once been whispered about in the neighborhood for her knowledge of spirits and curses. She agreed to see him, though her eyes widened in recognition and fear when she looked at him. You are bound, she said flatly, after listening to his account. Not just by wealth, but by blood and spirits. The covenant you agreed to, it is not just a contract. It is a bond sealed in life and death. To break it is impossible. Damilare fell to his knees, tears streaming. There must be a way. I will do anything. I will sacrifice everything. Just release me, please. The herbalist shook her head. No wealth, no sacrifice, no repentance can undo the debt you owe. You denied your own blood. That is unforgivable in the eyes of the spirits. The only way is to pay the price demanded. Damilare's stomach dropped. He understood now. His wealth, his luxury, all the fame he had enjoyed, it had been built on the suffering of his family. And now, the spirits would take what they demanded. That night, the mansion became a scene of terror. Shadows filled every corner, twisting, stretching, alive. Whispers filled the rooms, voices overlapping in a deafening chorus. Blood denied. Life taken. Debt must be paid. Damilare screamed, clutching his head, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside him now, inside his mind. The visions of Tunde multiplied, the boy's eyes burning with judgment, his small hand reaching for him, accusing, demanding justice. By morning, the mansion was silent. Neighbors noticed the absence of movement, the stillness unusual for a man so flamboyant and public. Inside, Damale's body was found on the marble floor, pale and lifeless, his eyes wide open as if frozen in terror. 3 deep marks, like fingers, were pressed into his chest, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and iron. The newspapers reported his sudden death with a mix of shock and fascination. Some whispered about foul play. Others speculated about illness. No one knew the truth, that a man who had fed strangers and denied his family had finally met the price of his unnatural covenant. At the family compound, Bisi and her siblings heard the news quietly. There was no joy, no triumph, only a deep, quiet relief, mixed with sorrow. Tunde's death had been avenged in the way that justice sometimes comes in mysterious forms. The family finally understood that the man they had once called cousin had been under forces beyond ordinary comprehension, yet his choices had sealed his fate. Years later, the mansion remained empty, a haunted reminder of a life of gold without conscience. The city still remembered Chief Damale as generous, as wealthy, as a miracle worker, but in the shadows, the whispers persisted, warning all who might try to put gold above blood. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, those who walked near the abandoned mansion swore they saw a child's eyes glowing in the windows, a small voice whispering, "Not all wealth is a blessing. Not all generosity is pure. Blood cries louder than gold." The tale of Chief Damale became a warning, passed quietly from one generation to the next, that wealth obtained through darkness and selfishness carries a debt no money can repay, and that turning away your own blood is a sin that echoes beyond death. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe.